Section 17 of Little Journeys to the Homes of Great Scientists. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynn Thompson. Little Journeys to the Homes of Great Scientists by Elbert Hubbard. Thomas H. Huxley, Part 1. That man, I think, has a liberal education, whose body has been so trained in youth that it is the ready servant of his will, and does with ease and pleasure all that, as a mechanism, it is capable of; whose intellect is a clear, cold, logic engine, with all its parts of equal strength, and in smooth running order, ready, like a steam engine, to be turned to any kind of work, and to spin the gossamers as well as forge the anchors of the mind; whose mind is stored with the knowledge of the great fundamental truths of nature, and the laws of her operations; one who, no stunted ascetic, is full of life and fire, but whose passions have been trained to come to heel by a vigorous will, the servant of a tender conscience; one who has learned to love all beauty, whether of nature or of art, to hate all vileness, and to esteem others as himself. Thomas Henry Huxley. That was a great group of thinkers to which Huxley belonged. The Mutual Admiration Society forms the sunshine in which souls grow. Great men come in groups. Sir Francis Galton says there were 14 men in Greece in the time of Pericles, who made Athens possible. A man alone is only a part of a man. Praxiteles by himself could have done nothing. Ictinus might have drawn the plans for the Parthenon, but without Pericles the noble building would have remained for ever the stuff which dreams are made of. And they do say that without Aspasia, Pericles would have been a mere dreamer of dreams, and Walter Savage Landor overheard enough of their conversation to prove it. William Morris and 7 men working with him formed the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, and gave the workers and doers of the world an impetus they yet feel. Cambridge and Concord had 7 men who induced the Muses to come to America and take out papers. These men of the Barbizon school tinted the entire art world. Millet, Rousseau, Daubigny, Corot, Diaz; and the people who worked a complete revolution in the theological thought of Christendom were these: Darwin, Spencer, Mill, Tyndall, Wallace, Huxley, and, yes, George Eliot, who bolstered the brain of Herbert Spencer when he was learning to think for himself. When the Victory had become a rout, there were many others who joined forces with the evolutionists, but at first the thinkers named above stood together and received the rather unsavoury gibes and jeers of those who get their episcopopagy and science from the same source. Darwin was the only man in the group who was a university graduate, and he once said that he owed nothing to his alma mater save the stimulus derived from her disapproval. For the work these men had to do there was no precedent. No one had gone before and blazed the trail. Learning, like capital, is timid, but ignorance coupled with a desire to know is bold. Do I then make a plea for ignorance? Yes, most assuredly. It is just as well not to know so much, as to be a theologian and know so many things that are not true. Learning and institutions of learning subdue men into conformity. Only the man who belongs to nothing is free, and ignorance, as well as a certain indifference to what the world has said and done, is a necessary factor in the character of him who would do a great work. It was the combined ignorance and boldness of Columbus that made it possible for him to give the world a continent. Yet the man who has not had a college training often feels he has somehow missed something valuable. There is timidity and hesitation when he is in the presence of those who have had advantages; and Huxley felt this loss, more or less, up to his 35th year, when fate had him cross swords with college men, and then the truth became his that if he had had the regular university training, it was quite probable he would have accepted the doctrines the university taught, and would then have been in the camp of the enemy, instead of with what he called the blessed minority. Isolation is a great aid to the thinker. Some of the best books the world has ever known were written behind prison bars. Exile has done much for literature, and a protracted sea voyage has allowed many a good man to roam the universe in imagination. Some of Macaulay's best essays were written on board slow-going sailing ships that were blown by vagrant winds from England to India. Darwin, Hooker, and Huxley all got their scientific baptism on board of surveying ships, where time was plentiful and anything but fleeting, and most everything else was scarce. Huxley was only assistant surgeon on the Rattlesnake, and above him was a naturalist who much of his time lay in his bunk and read treatises on this and also on that. Huxley was the seventh child of a plodding school-teacher, born on the seventh day of the week, on a seventh floor back, he used to say. His genius for work came from his mother, a tireless, ambitious woman, who got things done while others were discussing them. Had she been a man, she would have been the leader of the opposition in the House of Commons, her son used to say. College education was not for that goodly brood. A living was the first thing, so after a good drilling in the 3 R's, Thomas Huxley was apprenticed to a pharmacist who paid him 6 shillings a week, a sum that the boy conscientiously gave to his mother. Oh, if in our school teaching we could only teach this one thing, a great thirst for knowledge. But this desire we cannot impart. It is trial, difficulty, obstacle, deprivation, and persecution that make souls hunger and thirst after knowledge. Young Huxley wanted to know. His thoroughness in the drug-store won the admiration of the doctors whose prescriptions he compounded, and several of them loaned him books and took him to clinics. And at 17 we find him with a free scholarship in Charing Cross Hospital, serving as nurse and assistant surgeon. Then came the appointment as assistant surgeon in the Navy, and the appointment to HMS Rattlesnake, bound on a 4-year trip to the Antipodes, all quite as a matter of course. Life is a sequence. This happened to-day because you did that yesterday. To-morrow will be the result of to-day. The general idea of evolution was strong in the mind of young Huxley. He realized that nature was moving, growing, changing all things. He had studied embryology, and had seen how the body of a man begins as a single minute mass of protoplasm, without organs or dimensions. Behind the ship was his dragnet, and he worked almost constantly recording the different specimens of animals and vegetable life that he thus secured. The jellyfish attracted him most. To the ship's naturalist, jellyfish were jellyfish, but Huxley saw there were many kinds, distinct, separate, peculiar. He began to dissect them, and thus began his book on jellyfish, just as Darwin wrote his work on barnacles. Huxley vowed to himself that before the Rattlesnake got back to England he would know more about jellyfish than any other living man. That his ambition was realized, no one now disputes. Among his first discoveries, it came to him with a thrill that a certain species of jellyfish bears a very close resemblance to the human embryo at a certain stage, and he remembered the dictum of Goethe that the growth of the individual mirrors the growth of the race, and he paraphrased it thus: the growth of the individual mirrors the growth of the species. So filled was he with the thought that he could not sleep, so he got up and paced the deck, and tried to explain his great thought to a second mate. He was getting ready for the Origin of the Species, which he once said to Darwin he would himself have written, if Darwin had been a little more of a gentleman and had held off for a few years. It was on board the Rattlesnake that Huxley wrote this great truth. Nature has no designs or intentions. All that live exist only because they have adapted themselves to the hard lines that nature has laid down. We progress as we comply. In Australia, while waiting for his ship to locate and map a dangerous reef, Huxley went ashore, and, as he playfully expressed it, ran upon another. The name of the most excellent young woman who was to become his wife was Henrietta Heathorn, and Julian Hawthorne has discovered that she belongs to the same good stock from whence came our Nathaniel of Salem. It did not take the young naturalist and this stranded waif 7,000 miles from home long to see that they had much in common. Both were eager for truth, both had the ability to cut the introduction and reach live issues directly. "I saw you were a woman with whom only honesty would answer," he wrote her 30 years after. He was still in love with her. Yet she was a proud soul, and no assistant surgeon on an insignificant sloop would answer her. When he got his surgeon's commission she would marry him. And it was 7 years before she journeyed to England alone with that delightful object in view. He had to serve for her as Jacob did for Rachel, with this difference: Jacob loved several, but Thomas Huxley loved but one. Huxley's wife was his companion, confidant, comrade, friend. I cannot recall another so blessed in all the annals of thinking men, save John Stuart Mill. "I tell her everything I know, or guess, or imagine, so as to get it straight in my own mind," he said to John Fiske. In that most interesting work, Life and Lessons of Huxley, compiled by his son Leonard, are constant references and allusions to this most ideal mating. In reply to the question, "Is marriage a failure?" I would say, "No, provided the man marries a woman like Huxley's wife, and the woman marries a man like Huxley." There is a classic aphorism which runs about this way: "Knock, and the world knocks with you; boost, and you boost alone." Like most popular sayings, this is the truth turned wrong side out. John Fiske once called Thomas Huxley an appreciative iconoclast. That is to say, Huxley was a persistent protester, which is different from a Protestant, and, at the same time, he was a friend who never faltered, and grew faint in time of trouble. Huxley always sniffed the battle from afar, and said, "Ha, ha!" There be those who so declare that the success of Huxley was owing to his taking the tide at the flood, and riding into high favour on the Darwinian wave. To say that there would have been no Huxley had there been no Darwin, would be one of those unkind cuts the cruelty of which lies in its truth. It is equally true that if there had been no Lincoln, there would have been no Grant. But Grant was a very great man just the same, so why raise the issue? Darwin summed up and made nebulae of the truths which Huxley had, up to that time, held only in gaseous form. Darwin was born in the immortal year 1809. Huxley was born in 1825. When The Origin of the Species was published in 1859, Thomas Huxley was 34 years old. He had made his 4 years' trip around the world on the surveying ship Rattlesnake, just as Darwin had made his eventful voyage on the Beagle. These men in many ways had paralleled each other, but Darwin had 16 years the start, and during these years he had steadily and silently worked to prove the great truth that he had sensed intuitively years before in the South Seas. The Origin of the Species sheds light in 10,000 ways on the fact that all life has evolved from very lowly forms, and is still ascending; that species were not created by fiat, but that every species was the sure and necessary result of certain conditions. Until The Origin of the Species was published, and for some years afterward, the immutability of species was taught in all colleges and everywhere accepted by the so-called learned men. Goethe had somewhat dimly prophesied the discovery of the law of evolution, but his ideas on natural science were regarded by the schools as quite on a par with those of Dante. neither was taken seriously. Darwin proved his hypothesis. Doubtless, very many schoolmen would have accepted the theory, but to admit that man was not created outright, complete, and in his present form, or superior to it, seemed to involve a contradiction of the Mosaic account of creation, and the breaking up of Christianity, and these things alone, many thought, would entail moral chaos, destruction of private interests, and moral confusion being one and the same thing to those whose interests are involved. And so, for conscience' sake, Darwin was bitterly assailed and opposed. Opportunity, which knocks many times at each man's door, rapped hard at Huxley's door in 1860. It was at Oxford, at a meeting of the British Association for the Advancement of Science. "A big society with a slightly ironical name," once said Huxley. The audience was large and fashionable, delegates being present from all parts of the British Empire. The Origin of the Species had been published the year before, and tongues were wagging. Darwin was not present, but Huxley, who was known to be a personal friend of Darwin, was in his seat. The intent of the chairman was to keep Darwin and his pestiferous book out of all the discussions. Darwin was a good man to smother with silence. But Samuel Wilberforce, Bishop of Oxford, in the course of a speech on another subject, began to run short of material, and so switched off upon a theme which he had already exploited from the pulpit with marked effect. All public speakers carry this boiler-plate matter for use in time of stress. The bishop began to denounce those enemies of the Church and society who make covert attacks upon the Bible in the name of science. He warmed to his theme, and by a specious series of misstatements and various appeals to the prejudices of his audience, worked the assemblage up to a high pitch of hilarity and enthusiasm. Toward the close of his speech he happened to spy Huxley seated near, and pointing a pudgy finger at him, begged to be informed if the learned gentleman was really willing to be regarded as a descendant of a monkey. As the bishop sat down there was a wild burst of applause and much laughter, but amid the din were calls, "Huxley! Huxley!" These shouts increased as it came over the people that while the bishop had made a great speech, he had gone a trifle too far in ridiculing a member who up to this time had been silent. The good English spirit of fair play was at work. Still Huxley sat silent. Then the enemy, thinking he was completely vanquished, took up the cry with intent to add to his discomfiture, "Huxley! Huxley!" Slowly Huxley arose. He stood still until the last buzzing whisper had died away. When he spoke it was in so low a tone that people leaned forward to catch his words. Huxley knew his business. His slowness to speak created an atmosphere. There was no jest in his voice or manner. The air grew tense. His quiet reserve played itself off against the florid exuberance of the bishop. The bishop was not a man given to exact statements. His knowledge of science was general, not specific. Huxley demolished his card-house point by point, correcting the gross misstatements, and ending by saying that since a question of personal preferences had been brought into the discussion of a great scientific theme, he would confess that if the alternatives were a descent on the one hand from a respectable monkey, or from the other from a bishop of the Church of England who could stoop to misrepresentation and sophistry, and who had attempted in that presence to show discredit upon a man who had given his life to the cause of science, then if forced to decide, he would declare in favour of the monkey. When Huxley took his seat there was a silence that could be felt. Several ladies fainted. There were fears that the bishop would reply, and to keep down such a possible unpleasant move the audience now applauded Huxley roundly, and amid the din the chairman declared the meeting adjourned. From that time forward Huxley was famous throughout England as a man to let alone in public debate. End of Section 17.